Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ever feel like the news is always throwing these like big numbers about UK immigration at you? But it's just like, what does that even mean? Why should I care? Oh, that's what we're tackling today, UK net migration. And trust me, it's way more interesting than it sounds. But first, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future deep dives like this one.
Absolutely. Those numbers are often just like thrown around without much explanation.
Exactly. And they're actually really important to understanding UK politics and society as a whole.
Right.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The Office for National Statistics, or ONS, they just revised their net migration figures. And wow, they are something else.
Yeah.
We're talking a record high of 906,000 people in 2023. That's way more than anyone initially predicted. It's kind of crazy how these numbers can change as more information becomes available, don't you think?
Yeah, it is noteworthy how much these figures have shifted.
Right, like who knows what else they might find as they dig deeper. And while that 2023 number is definitely grabbing headlines, the ONS also reported that net migration actually fell by 20% in the year leading up to June 2024. So now it's at 728,000, which is still high historically, sure, but it's definitely a downward trend. What's your take on that shift? Especially considering it happened before that recent election. What do you think is going on here? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments.
Well, it's certainly interesting to see that.
Right. So the ONS gives a few reasons for these revised figures. One is simply having more complete data as time goes on, which makes sense. But they also specifically mention better analysis of migration due to the conflict in Ukraine and improved estimations of non-EU migration. What stands out to you in those explanations? Yeah, I found that last part about non-EU migration interesting too. Seems like that's been a bit of a blind spot in the past. So it's good to see the ONS working to get a clearer picture. And of course, the influx of Ukrainian refugees has been a major factor in recent years too.
All right.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The source mentions some policies enacted by Rishi Sunak's government. Things like limiting international students and healthcare workers from bringing family with them and raising the bar for sponsoring spouses. Those policies likely contributed to that dip in net migration we talked about.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on those policy choices?
It is worth considering the impact of those, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And it seems like those policies are having an effect. But it's all happening against the backdrop of these record-breaking numbers. So it's a tough situation for any government to navigate.
Yeah, it really is.
The article even quotes Sundar Katwala, the director of the migration think tank British Future. He says, "It remains to be seen how much the public will notice a fall in visa numbers if there is no progress on controlling the much more visible channel crossings." What do you think about that? Makes you think right. Because even if the government is technically reducing net migration through these visa changes, the optics of those boats arriving can really overshadow that progress. It's such a powerful image. Understandably so. And it speaks to people's concerns about immigration in a way that, like, statistics just can't. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about public perception when you're analyzing these trends.
Absolutely. And speaking of costs, the source mentions government spending on asylum jumped to over £5 billion in 2023-24. That's a whopping 36% increase. This whole topic has so many layers, economic, social, and political. It's a lot to process. But before we jump into those implications, I want to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you so far? What are your initial reactions to these numbers? Drop a comment below and let's keep this conversation going.
It's fascinating to consider.
It is. Okay, so we've laid out the numbers, but what do they actually mean for the UK? It's a lot more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's one thing to talk about net migration in the abstract, but it's another to understand how it's actually impacting the economy, society, and the political landscape.
Right.
So let's start with the economic side. Immigration can be a double-edged sword, can't it? On the one hand, it can boost the workforce, bring in new ideas, even lead to new businesses. But on the other hand, it can put a strain on public services and potentially lead to competition for jobs and resources. What are your thoughts on how this all plays out in the UK specifically?
Well, it's interesting to consider the UK government's approach.
Yeah.
Trying to attract certain skilled workers while limiting others.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like they're trying to handpick who they think will be the most useful to the economy. But predicting the future like that is tricky, right?
Yeah.
The needs of the economy are constantly changing. Sometimes the people who end up making the biggest impact aren't the ones anyone expected. What do you think about that balancing act, trying to guess what skills are going to be valuable years down the line? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation for sure.
And it's not just about the overall economic impact either. Different sectors are going to feel it differently. Some industries might actually benefit from an influx of lower wage workers, while others really need highly specialized professionals. It's never as simple as saying immigration is good or bad for the economy as a whole.
Right.
Okay, so let's shift gears for a sec and talk about the social impact. Even if the economics are debatable, there's no denying that immigration changes the fabric of a society. It brings in new cultures, languages, ideas, which can be an amazing thing. It can make a place more vibrant and dynamic. But it can also lead to tensions and conflicts, especially when people feel like their way of life is being threatened or their values are being challenged. What are your initial thoughts on that side of the issue?
Well, it's a complex issue with no easy answers. There are a lot of factors to consider.
Absolutely. There's no denying it's a messy and complicated situation. And the source we're looking at today talks a lot about public perception, particularly around those channel crossings. Even if the overall number of migrants is relatively small, if they're concentrated in certain areas or perceived as different in some way, it can create friction and resentment.
Right.
And that's where things get really politically charged, because politicians often exploit those fears and anxieties for their own gain. It's a good reminder that we need to be careful about the language we use when talking about these issues, and we need to challenge those who spread misinformation and prejudice. Wouldn't you agree?
I would.
Okay, so let's talk politics. How are UK political parties approaching this whole migration issue? We know that the Conservatives under Sunak have been pushing policies to limit certain types of migration. It was a big part of their platform, this idea of taking back control. But as we've seen, it's not that straightforward.
No, it isn't.
And now that Labour is in power, it'll be really interesting to see how they handle it. They've typically been more open to immigration, but they also have to be aware of public sentiment and how those anxieties are being exploited by certain groups. It's a tricky balancing act for any party to navigate. What do you think their approach will be? Let us know your predictions down in the comments.
It's difficult to say for sure.
It is, right. And then you've also got parties like the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, who tend to have even more liberal views on migration. So you've got this whole spectrum of opinions and no easy consensus. This issue is going to be front and center in UK politics for a long time to come, don't you think?
Yes, likely.
Before we wrap up, I want to circle back to those revised ONS figures we talked about at the beginning. The fact that they were adjusted so dramatically raises some important questions about how we track and understand migration patterns. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it just shows that statistics, while useful, aren't perfect.
Right. You can't tell the whole story.
Exactly.
They can give us like a snapshot of a particular moment in time, but they can't capture the complexity of human experience.
Right.
And that actually brings us to the most important takeaway here. When we talk about migration, it's easy to get lost in the abstract numbers and the political rhetoric. But we can't forget that we're talking about real people's lives, people making incredibly difficult decisions, leaving their homes, and trying to build new lives in a new country. We need to keep that human element in mind.
I agree.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground today. What are your biggest takeaways from this deep dive on UK net migration? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going. And as always, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives like this one. We're exploring a new topic every week, so hit that notification bell so you don't miss out. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring. It's so important to remember that. These aren't just numbers we're talking about. There are real people behind each one of those data points.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive today. We started by looking at those revised ONS figures, those record-breaking net migration numbers for the UK. And we've talked about some of the factors that are driving those trends. And of course, we've explored the impact of all this on the economy, society, and even politics. It's a complex issue, no doubt about it. But before we go, I want to leave you with just a few key takeaways to kind of wrap things up.
Okay.
So first and foremost, migration is a really complex issue, and there are no easy answers. There are valid arguments on all sides of this debate, and it's important to approach this topic with a sense of nuance and understanding, would you say?
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
And the second takeaway is this. Statistics can be misleading. It's easy to get caught up in the numbers, but we can't just take them at face value. We need to dig a little deeper, understand how they're collected, and, think about the broader context.
Right. It's not the whole picture.
Exactly. And that brings us to the final takeaway, and I think this is the most important one. Behind every single statistic is a person with a story. And we can't forget that.
Absolutely.
So that's our deep dive on UK net migration. I hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit thought-provoking. What stood out to you most about this topic? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let's keep this conversation going. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to give us a like and subscribe to the channel for more in-depth explorations of these complex issues. We're diving into a new topic every single week, so hit that notification bell so you don't miss out. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep exploring.